before he became one of the most controversial voices in NBA history, before his name was mentioned as someone decades ahead of his time, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was once the embodiment of an American dream that millions of poor children pursued. A basketball prodigy, one of the best shooters of his generation, a rare talent who turned the limitations of his body into art on the court. From his lonely days in Mississippi to the bright lights of the NBA, he conquered one of the harshest arenas in the world with discipline, faith, and an indomitable will that refused to yield to adversity. Millions once admired him as a symbol of resilience. A boy with Tourette syndrome, mocked, misunderstood, and seen as abnormal, but still rising to become a star in American basketball. But behind that story was a life that was not glorious but full of pain. A childhood overshadowed by poverty, a body that did not obey its own commands. Years lived with shame, isolation, and a feeling of not belonging anywhere. A long search for identity, faith, and the meaning of life. Then one day, at the peak of his career, he became the center of a controversy that changed his entire destiny. Fierce criticism, doors slowly closing. A career once predicted to lead to the Hall of Fame began to slip away. And in the years that followed, when much of America turned its back, he had to learn to live with a loneliness that very few could imagine. Now, at 57 years old, when the cheers have faded, when the games are only memories, and when history begins to look back at his story with a different eye, one question has never disappeared. What really happened to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf? What made one of the most special talents in the NBA leave the league while still capable of playing at the highest level? Did it all start with the controversy in 1996? Or was that just the final chapter of a story that had begun long before? A story about suffering, faith, sacrifice, and the terrible price a person sometimes has to pay to live according to their conscience. If you have ever wondered why Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf disappeared from the NBA, the answer does not lie in a single moment. It lies in an entire life, a life that America saw but never truly understood. If Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story makes you reflect on the price a person has to pay to live, according to their beliefs, please hit subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss inspiring stories like this one. And right now, let's go back to Mississippi, where a lonely boy is preparing to enter the first battle of his life, the battle with his own body that he could not control. There are children born who have to fight poverty. There are children who grow up in broken families. But Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf carried a different burden that was much harder to understand. It was the battle with his own body. He was born on March 9, 1969, in Gulfport, Mississippi, a small coastal city deep in the American South. Those years were not gentle with poor black families. Old neighborhoods, rundown houses, bills that always came before paychecks, and mothers who worked themselves to exhaustion just to keep a roof over their children's heads were familiar images of life there. Mahmoud, at that time, still went by the name Christopher Wayne Jackson. The boy grew up mostly under the care of his mother, Jacqueline Jackson, the woman who had to shoulder the entire family in extremely difficult circumstances. Life had never been easy, but what made Christopher's childhood painful was not just poverty. From a very young age, his body began to show strange signs that no one could explain. His eyes blinked uncontrollably. His head suddenly jerked to one side. His face twitched in moments without warning. Sometimes strange sounds escaped his throat even though he did not want them to. Christopher did not understand what was happening. His mother did not understand. Those around him understood even less. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, very few people knew about Tourette syndrome. Many had never heard the name. So instead of receiving sympathy, the boy only got strange looks. Other children looked at him as if he had something wrong. They laughed when his head suddenly jerked hard. They imitated his movements. They mocked the way he blinked continuously in class. Every day at school was like stepping into a battle that Christopher never wanted to join. There were mornings he woke up and promised himself that today he would try to sit still more, Try not to jerk his head. Try not to make sounds that drew attention. But just a few minutes later, his body would betray him again. Those movements would return. The laughter would ring out again. The most heartbreaking thing was that Christopher did not know he had an illness. He only knew that he was different from everyone else. A child who could not understand why his body would not obey him. A child who could not understand why things that were very simple for others became daily challenges for him. In class, concentrating became difficult. The tics made teachers think multiple times that he was not paying attention to the lesson. Some thought he had learning problems. Others thought he was deliberately causing disruption. No one saw the fear growing inside that boy. Christopher began to withdraw. He spoke less, communicated less. He learned to sit in dark corners, learned to avoid other people's eyes, learned to live in silence to reduce the wounds that the world constantly threw at him. But the loneliness did not disappear. It only grew bigger. Many years later, when he had become an NBA star, Mahmoud once admitted that his childhood was overshadowed by a feeling of isolation. Not because he wanted to separate from everyone, but because he felt like he had never truly belonged anywhere. While other children ran and jumped carefree, he worried about his body's next movement. While other children made friends easily, he always faced the fear of being mocked. Even in the most normal moments, Christopher still had to spend energy trying to control things that others never had to think about. That made his childhood exhausting in a way that very few could understand. Even more painful was that he began to believe that perhaps what others said about him was true. Perhaps he really was strange. Perhaps he really was abnormal. Perhaps his life would never be like others. In those years, Christopher could not know that the illness tormenting him would one day have a name. He also could not know that the world would eventually understand what no one understood then. All he knew was that every morning waking up felt like stepping into a new battle. A battle with no spectators, no medals, no clear victories. Just a small boy trying to survive in a body he could not control. And as that loneliness stretched from year to year, Christopher Wayne Jackson began to search for the only place that could help him forget everything. A place where mocking eyes disappeared. A place where his body finally stayed silent. A place that would change his entire life forever. That was the basketball court. But before basketball became Christopher Wayne Jackson's only refuge, that boy's life was still overshadowed by worries that no child should have to bear. Gulfport, Mississippi in the 1970s was not a place of big dreams. It was a place where many families just tried to survive week after week, month after month. For the Jackson family, every day that passed was a silent struggle. Christopher's mother, Jacqueline Jackson, had to work non-stop to support her children. There were no savings, no guarantees for the future, only bills that kept appearing, and a mother trying to earn enough money to keep her family from sinking deeper into hardship. Christopher was still too young to understand all the pressures his mother was enduring, but he was old enough to see the exhaustion on her face every evening. He saw her calloused hands after long hours of work. He saw that woman wake up before dawn and return home when it was dark. There were nights she sat quietly at the kitchen table, trying to calculate how long the little money left could last. There were days the refrigerator was almost empty. There were meals divided smaller than usual to be enough for everyone. Many years later, Mahmoud still remembered the feeling of watching his mother sacrifice everything to raise her children while she had nothing left for herself. That was the image that followed him throughout his life. Not the stadiums packed with spectators, not the cheers in the NBA, but the image of a single mother fighting poverty every day without ever allowing herself to collapse. For Christopher, poverty was not just about lacking money. It was the feeling of inferiority that always clung to him. It was seeing other children have new clothes while he had to wear old ones again. It was the feeling of shame when he could not have the things his friends saw as normal. It was always having to think before asking his mother for anything, because he knew she had already worked too hard. There were times he felt angry, not at his mother, but at life, at the feeling that he had started behind everyone else right for the first day. Meanwhile, the neighborhood where Christopher grew up became increasingly dangerous. Violence was present everywhere. Fights, street gangs, older boys always trying to prove themselves through recklessness and aggression. Many children of Christopher's generation grew up amid those temptations. Some started getting into trouble early. Some stepped onto a path they could not turn back from later. For a boy who already felt lost and lonely, that environment became even more frightening. Christopher always felt that he was only a few steps away from terrible things. He saw what was happening around him. He saw young people losing their futures before they were old enough to understand what a future was. But what worried him most was still himself. The Tourette symptoms did not disappear. On the contrary, they became clearer as he grew up. Each passing year brought a new fear. Christopher did not know what was happening inside his body. There was no accurate diagnosis, no clear answers, only prolonged anxiety. What would happen when he grew up? Could he have a normal job? Could he live like others? Or would this illness follow him forever? Those questions appeared even when he was still very young. Sometimes Christopher looked into the future and saw nothing but a hazy darkness. Those around him did not expect much from him. Some teachers thought he had cognitive limitations. Some thought he would never achieve anything great. Those judgments were like shadows that clung to him for many years. But right in that harsh circumstance, something else was also quietly forming. That was the will to survive. Christopher learned to endure, learned to stand up after being mocked, learned to keep going even when feeling lonely, learned to endure difficult days without complaining. No one noticed that at the time. Even Christopher did not realize it. But each time he got through a bad day, he became a little stronger. Each time he faced discriminatory looks, he learned to endure a little more. The years of poverty, fear, and inferiority did not destroy him as many thought. They were quietly forging a rare mental strength. A strength that would later help Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf face much bigger storms, because in just a few more years, the poor boy in Gulfport would find the only place where all fears disappeared. A place where mocking laughter no longer mattered. A place where poverty no longer determined a person's value. A place where for the first time in his life, Christopher Wayne Jackson felt he could become someone. And then that place appeared in the simplest form possible. Not a miracle, not a great teacher, not an unexpected life-changing opportunity. Just an old basketball, a concrete court, and a boy trying to find a place to escape his own life. When Christopher Wayne Jackson first truly connected with basketball, he did not think about the NBA. He did not think about fame. He did not think about money either. What he sought was much simpler. He just wanted to find a place where the pain could disappear for a moment. A place where mocking laughter no longer chased him. A place where his body finally agreed to stop betraying him. The strange thing was that it really happened. While in school, the eye tics, the uncontrolled movements, and the manifestations of Tourette kept appearing, on the basketball court, everything seemed to change. When Christopher focused completely on the ball, on the movement of his feet, on the hoop in the distance, the symptoms that had tormented him decreased significantly. No one could explain that to him at the time. Even Christopher did not understand. He only knew that this was the only place he felt normal. This was the only place where his body and mind no longer fought each other. For the first time in his life, he felt free. From then on, basketball was no longer a game. It became a refuge. While other children played for a few hours and then went home, Christopher stayed longer. He shot until it got dark. He stayed after everyone else had left. Many days, the sound of the ball hitting the court was the last sound echoing in the neighborhood. There were hot summer afternoons that took your breath away. Sweat running down his face, legs aching, hands burning, but Christopher kept shooting, over and over, hour after hour. No one asked him to do it. There was no coach standing by, no cheering crowd. Just a lonely boy trying to perfect the only thing that made him feel valuable. Many years later, when he had become an NBA star, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf once admitted that much of his childhood was spent on solo practice sessions. Not because he hated people, but because on the basketball court, he no longer felt like a boy with Tourette. He was no longer the boy who was teased, no longer the poor kid who had to wear old clothes, no longer the person who always felt different. On the court, he was just Christopher, and that meant everything. Each successful shot felt like a small victory over life. Each day of improving a little felt like confirmation that his future was not completely dictated by the illness or poor circumstances. Gradually, Christopher began to realize he had a special ability. His shots were more accurate than most kids his age. The feeling of the ball leaving his fingertips almost became instinct. While others needed hundreds of practice repetitions to remember the motion, Christopher seemed born knowing where the ball wanted to go. But what made him different the most was not talent. It was obsession. He practiced more than anyone. There were days Christopher shot hundreds of times. There were days thousands of times. He repeated the same motion until it became part of his body. In a life where so many things were beyond control, basketball was the only thing he could control, and so he clung to it with all his strength. While many kids his age were drawn into the temptations of the neighborhood, Christopher spent his time on the court. While others tried to escape reality with alcohol, cigarettes, or street trouble, he tried to escape reality with his shots. That was the choice that saved his life even before he realized it. Neighbors began to notice. Local coaches began to notice. They saw something special in the skinny boy who always stayed on the back court. They saw a rare determination, a fire unlike other kids. But Christopher still had not seen that in himself. At that time, he did not dream of becoming a legend. He did not dream of becoming a television star. He was not even sure he had a future. The only thing he knew was that every time he held the ball, the pain eased. Every time he saw the ball fly through the air and go through the hoop, he felt like he had just defeated another part of his fate. Gradually, that feeling turned into ambition. If basketball could help him escape the darkest moments, maybe it could also take him out of Gulfport. If basketball could make people stop looking at him like a strange kid, maybe it could also make them see his true self. If basketball could bring him some peace, maybe it could also change his entire life. That was the first time Christopher Wayne Jackson began to believe in something that seemed impossible. That a poor boy with Tourette, growing up amid fears and inferiority, could rewrite his own story. And not long after that, the rest of America would also begin to pay attention to that boy. A basketball prodigy was emerging from a place no one expected, and not long after, the rest of America began to pay attention to that boy. At first, it was just word of mouth among local coaches. A kid in Gulfport could shoot the ball in a way people rarely saw. Then those rumors spread further, from the small high school gyms of Mississippi to college scouts across the South. Christopher Wayne Jackson was no longer Gulfport's secret. He was becoming a phenomenon. The stands that used to have only scattered viewers began to fill up every time the Gulfport high school team took the court. At first, people came out of curiosity. Then they returned out of amazement. And finally they came because they understood they were witnessing something special. Christopher scored in a way that left opponents helpless. Long-range shots that seemed impossible. Confident ball handling. A sense of rhythm and spacing that even many older players did not have. In many games, he became the center of attention from the first minutes. Scoreboards lit up with numbers that few high school students could produce. Each passing week brought a new article, a new record, a new praise. People who once did not know who Christopher Wayne Jackson was now began to remember that name. But behind the applause, another battle quietly continued. When the final whistle blew and the crowd left, Tourette was still there. The illness did not disappear just because he scored more points. The eye tics still appeared. The abnormal movements still followed him home. There were nights Christopher sat alone in his room and wondered why life was so strange. On the court, people called him a genius. Off the court, many still looked at him like a strange kid. That contrast sometimes confused him. A part of him began to believe he could become someone, but the other part still remembered very clearly the feeling of being mocked throughout his childhood. Perhaps that was why Christopher practiced more than anyone. Not because he wanted to be famous, not because he wanted to appear on television, but because basketball was the only thing that had never betrayed him. It did not care what illness he had. It did not mock the abnormal movements. It did not judge family circumstances or the money in his pocket. If he practiced hard, it would give results. That was the simple and fair rule that Christopher always longed to find in life. Practice hours began to become more intense. There were mornings he woke up before dawn to shoot. There were evenings he was still on the court when streetlights came on. People said Christopher could stand for hours just to perfect one single motion. If a shot was not perfect, he would repeat it. If a footstep was not right, he would do it again. Gradually, that obsession turned into excellence. In his final season at Gulfport High School, Christopher was not just the best player in the area. He became one of the most sought-after high school students in America. Big universities began to call. Famous coaches began to appear in the stands. Comparisons with future stars became more frequent. Some believed he was the best scoring talent to appear in Mississippi in many years. Others went further. They believed he could become an NBA star in the future. For many children, that would be a moment to celebrate. But for Christopher, it came with a new fear. The more famous he became, the more pressure he felt. The more attention he received, the more he worried about the things he could not control. He feared that one day people would see the illness instead of the talent. Feared that everything he had built would collapse just because of things he could not change. But for the first time in his life, that fear was no longer stronger than hope. Because when he saw the scouts sitting in the stands, when he read the articles written about him, when he heard others mention the NBA as something that could completely happen, Christopher began to allow himself to believe in a dream he had never dared to think about before. A boy who grew up in poverty, a child who was once mocked because of a strange illness, a person who always felt lost in this world. Could he really step into the biggest league on the planet? Could all those years of suffering finally lead to something good? When the high school season ended, Christopher Wayne Jackson was no longer the unknown boy in Gulfport. He became one of the most sought-after young talents in America, and ahead of him now was a much bigger stage. A place where his talent would amaze the whole country, a place called LSU. And when Christopher Wayne Jackson set foot at Louisiana State University, or LSU, he no longer carried only his own dream. He carried the expectations of an entire small city in Mississippi, the sacrifices of a mother who had worked to exhaustion for many years, and the childhood wounds that had never truly healed. LSU was a completely different world, bigger arenas, more spectators, heavier pressure. This was where the best talents in America gathered, a place where many high school stars who had once been praised were quickly forgotten. But Christopher did not take long to prove that he was not like the majority. Right in his first game wearing the LSU jersey in 1988, he did what few had imagined. He scored 53 points, not in an unusually long multi-overtime game, not against a weak opponent, but in his very first debut at the college basketball level. The spectators in the stands could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Every time LSU needed points, Christopher appeared. Every time opponents thought they had found a way to stop him, he scored another shot. When the final whistle blew, a new star of American college basketball had officially been born. Major sports newspapers began to print his name on the front page. Sports television programs mentioned him constantly. Experts were amazed at the almost unlimited scoring ability of the boy from Gulfport. And that was just the beginning. In the following months, Christopher continued to score at an astonishing pace. He broke one record after another. The best organized defenses could not stop him. There were games where he scored so many points that opponents were almost helpless. Every time he stepped on the court, He brought the feeling that something special was about to happen. In a short time, Christopher Jackson became one of the most famous names in the NCAA. LSU fans went crazy for him. The stands were always packed. Children began to wear jerseys with his name. Reporters crowded for interviews. Praises came from everywhere across America. Some experts called him the most natural scorer of his generation. Others believed he was the best talent LSU had ever had. Many began to talk about the NBA as if it was something that would definitely happen. But behind all those lights was a completely different story. While the public saw a basketball phenomenon, Christopher was still living with the old battles. Tourette had never left him. It was still there every day. The eye tics, the involuntary movements, the moments when his body suddenly did not obey his will. Only one thing was different. Now he had learned to hide them better. On the court, near absolute focus made the symptoms decrease significantly. But off the court, everything still existed. There were days Christopher felt exhausted from constantly controlling himself. There were nights he lay awake in the dorm while everyone thought his life was perfect. The heartbreaking thing was that the more successful he became, the greater the pressure. Each game now was no longer a normal game. It became a national test. Every shot was analyzed, every mistake was exaggerated, every move was monitored. For a young man who had grown up in anxiety and inferiority, that pressure sometimes became suffocating. Christopher began to feel the weight of fame very early. Fans loved him, but they also demanded more from him. The media praised him, but at the same time placed enormous expectations on his shoulders. Every week, new articles predicting his future appeared. Every month, there were more comparisons with basketball legends. For many, that was a dream, but for Christopher, sometimes it felt like a coat too heavy for an 18-year-old boy. He was still the boy who had lived in poverty, still the child who was once mocked because of his illness, still the person who always feared that one day people would discover the insecurities he was trying to hide. But every time he stepped on the court, all doubts seemed to vanish. Basketball was still the only place he felt truly free. And that was why he continued to score, continued to win, continued to do things others thought impossible. After 2 seasons at LSU, Christopher Jackson was no longer the local prodigy of Gulfport. He had become a national phenomenon, one of the most famous players in American college basketball, a star that every NBA team followed closely. Those who once thought that boy with Tourette would have no future now had to see him appear on national television. Those who once doubted now had to admit his extraordinary talent. And when the final season at LSU ended, Christopher knew that the next chapter of his life was waiting ahead. The chapter he had dreamed of since the days he was alone on the court in Gulfport. The chapter called the NBA. And then the day that Christopher Wayne Jackson had imagined throughout those years alone on the court in Gulfport finally came. In June of 1990, in the NBA draft arena, the young man who had grown up in poverty, who had been mocked for the uncontrolled movements of his body, was waiting to hear his name called among the best talents in America. Just a few years earlier, many people still did not believe that boy would have a normal future. Now, the entire basketball world was looking toward him. When the Denver Nuggets used the 3rd pick to call Chris Jackson's name, a new chapter in his life officially began. It was not just the moment of realizing the NBA dream. It was the moment when all the years of pain, inferiority, and loneliness seemed to finally be repaid. For many, a handshake on the draft stage was just a formality. But for Christopher, it was proof that the boy who once felt he did not belong in this world had found his place. In that moment, he thought of his mother, thought of the days of deprivation, thought of the long practice hours until late at night, thought of all the times he was laughed at. And for the first time, the future was no longer a darkness full of anxiety. It appeared before his eyes with all its brilliance. Denver welcomed him as one of the most valuable young talents in the league. A new city, a new team, a new life. Everything changed so fast that sometimes even Christopher could not keep up. Just a few years earlier, He had worried about whether his family had enough money to cover living expenses or not. Now, he signed his first professional contract in life. For the first time, there was money in the account. For the first time, he could buy his mother things she had never had. For the first time, he did not have to wake up with worries about bills or the next meal. For someone who grew up in poverty, that feeling was almost indescribable. But what made him happiest was not the money, it was being able to help his family. The mother who had sacrificed her entire youth to raise her children could finally breathe a little easier. The years of hardship had not completely disappeared from memory, but at least they no longer controlled their future. The early days in the NBA were not easy. This league was faster, stronger, more ruthless than anything he had ever experienced. NBA defenders did not care how many points you had scored in the NCAA. They only cared if you could do it against them or not. There were early games that made Christopher understand he still had a lot to learn. But instead of fear, he felt excited. Throughout his life, he had always had to prove himself. And this was just the next challenge. What surprised the coaches was his adaptation speed. Christopher did not just survive in the NBA. He progressed very quickly. Each season, he became more dangerous. His scoring ability became more refined. His long-range shots became more accurate. His ball handling became more confident. Opponents began to realize that the skinny boy from Mississippi was not a temporary phenomenon. He truly belonged in this league. Meanwhile, Tourette still quietly existed. Millions of spectators saw the perfect shots. But very few knew the battles he still faced every day. There were mornings he woke up with the same symptoms that had followed him since childhood. There were moments he still struggled with the feeling of being different. But the NBA had given him something his childhood never had: confidence. Each successful game felt like confirmation that he was stronger than his illness. Each better season than the previous one felt like a victory over all those who had once doubted him. Then the numbers began to speak for themselves. Christopher became one of the best free throw shooters in the entire league. Shots from the free throw line almost became art. There were seasons when he achieved a free throw percentage that amazed the entire NBA. In an era when many stars still struggled with the most basic shots, Chris Jackson turned them into something almost certain. Coaches trusted him in decisive moments. Teammates wanted the ball in his hands when the game entered the final minutes. That accuracy was not random. It was the result of thousands of hours of practice from the days he was a lonely boy in Gulfport. Each perfect shot on the NBA court was built from those unobserved afternoons on the old concrete court back then. By the early 1990s, the future seemed wider open than ever. Christopher was no longer just a promising young player. He was becoming one of the most notable scoring guards in the NBA. In 1993, he won the Most Improved Player award. That recognition felt like confirmation that he was on the right path. Experts began to talk about future All-Star appearances. Some believed he had only touched a small part of his potential. He was still young. He was healthy. He kept progressing. Every sign showed that the best years were still ahead. After everything he had been through, Christopher Wayne Jackson finally allowed himself to believe that life would no longer continue to challenge him as before. He believed the storms had stayed behind. He believed the future now belonged to basketball, success, and bigger dreams. But what Christopher did not know was that the biggest turning point of his life was not in the past. It was quietly approaching. And this time, what would change everything was not poverty, nor Tourette syndrome, but a much deeper search for the person he truly wanted to become. But what Christopher Wayne Jackson did not know was that the successes on the court had never answered the biggest questions in his heart. Money had come. Fame had come. Dreams that once seemed impossible had become reality. Yet deep inside, there was still a void that no shot could fill. When he was a poor boy in Gulfport, he once believed that if one day he escaped poverty, everything would be okay. Then he believed that if he made it to the NBA, all the pain would disappear. But when those things successively became true, he realized something that confused him. Success could change living circumstances, but it could not answer the question of who he was. It could not bring peace to the soul, and it could not help a person understand the true purpose of life. Those questions began to appear more and more as Christopher entered adulthood. Between flights, luxury hotels, and arenas packed with spectators, he often sat alone thinking about things that very few around him cared about. Why am I here in this world? What is truly important? Is success the final destination or not? While most people saw an NBA star rising, Christopher felt he was stepping into a completely different journey. A journey that did not take place on the court but inside the soul. It was during that time that he began to read books about history, religion, and the identity of black people in the United States. Among them, there was one name that impacted him more strongly than anyone else. Malcolm X. Christopher was drawn to the story of the man who had gone through suffering, injustice, and profound transformation in his life. He read the speeches. He studied Malcolm X's views on dignity, faith, and personal responsibility. What influenced Christopher was not politics. It was the discipline. It was the sense of purpose in life. It was the belief that a person could find their true value by living honestly with their conscience. The more he learned, the more he wanted to know about Islam. Reading sessions turned into conversations lasting for hours. Questions led to other questions. Gradually, Christopher felt like he was finding something he had been searching for a long time, a feeling of belonging, a spiritual foundation solid enough to help him stand firm amid the changes of life. The decision to convert did not come in one day. It was the result of many years of reflection, learning, and inner struggle. When Christopher officially converted to Islam, his life began to change in ways that few outsiders could understand. Priorities changed. Habits changed. The way he saw himself also changed. For the first time in many years, he felt he was living according to what his heart told him, rather than what others expected. But at the same time, he also understood that this decision would not be welcomed by everyone. In the American sports world of the early 1990s, an NBA star openly converting to Islam was still rare. Many did not understand. Some were curious. Others were skeptical. Christopher knew he was stepping into territory that not everyone was ready to accept. The biggest change came when he decided to abandon the name he had carried since birth. Christopher Wayne Jackson became Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. To the public, it was just a new name, but to him, it was a rebirth. The name Christopher was tied to a painful childhood, to the years struggling with Tourette syndrome and prolonged feelings of being lost, while Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf represented the person he was trying to become, a person guided by faith, discipline, and a clear sense of purpose in life. That decision surprised many. Some fans felt distant. Some journalists questioned whether he was trying to separate himself from the old image or not. Sports programs began to discuss. Articles appeared with all kinds of speculation. Some respected his choice. Some thought he had changed too much. Some simply did not understand. Mahmoud gradually realized that the more he lived true to himself, the more different he became in the eyes of many. That sometimes made him feel lonely. But unlike the loneliness of childhood, this was a loneliness he voluntarily accepted. Because for the first time in his life, he felt he knew exactly where he was going. While the world continued to see him as an NBA star, Mahmoud began to see himself as a man responsible for his beliefs. The game still continued. The points still increased. The praises still appeared in the media. But at the center of his life now was no longer basketball. It was faith. Faith became the place he turned to when he felt lost. Faith helped him understand the painful years of childhood. Faith helped him see poverty, illness, and old wounds from a different perspective. And most importantly, faith gave him a foundation that no victory or defeat on the court could take away. Yet it was that very faith that was quietly leading Mahmoud toward the biggest confrontation of his life. A confrontation not related to opponents on the court. not related to the scoreboard or titles. It was the confrontation between one person's conscience and an enormous power system. And just a few years later, the decision he made would change everything forever. Yet it was precisely at the moment when everything seemed most perfect that an invisible gap began to appear between Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf and the world around him. On the court, he was playing the best basketball of his career. The numbers became increasingly impressive. The shots became more accurate. The best defenses in the NBA still struggled when trying to stop him. The 1992 to 1993 season marked a major step forward when he won the Most Improved Player award. For many players, that was a sign that the glorious years were just beginning. For Mahmoud, it was also a well-deserved reward for the thousands of silent practice hours from his childhood. The boy who had once been mocked in Gulfport had now become one of the most notable scoring guards in the league. Those who had once doubted now had to acknowledge his talent. NBA arenas rang with cheers every time he held the ball. Experts began to mention him as one of the purest shooters of his generation. There were nights he made the entire arena stand up with unimaginable shots. There were games where even opponents had to shake their heads in frustration at his scoring ability. The respect grew steadily, not only from fans, but from the very players facing him. His teammates understood clearly what he had overcome to be there. They knew about Tourette syndrome. They knew about the difficult years before the NBA. They saw the dedication he gave to his work every day. The coaches appreciated his discipline. Opponents who had once seen him only as a small shooter now had to change their views. Mahmoud was not a star created by the media. He was the result of persistence spanning decades. And that was exactly what made many in the basketball world respect him. But while his career continued to develop, the feeling of belonging grew more distant, because Mahmoud's life at this point no longer revolved around the things that most of the NBA world cared about. Many players talked about new contracts. He talked about faith. Many talked about cars, houses, and fame. He spent time reading books, studying religion, and reflecting on a person's responsibility before God. The conversations he wanted to have became increasingly different from the conversations happening around him. The more mature he became, the more he realized he was viewing life through a different lens. Sometimes Mahmoud would walk into a room full of people but still feel lonely, not because anyone treated him badly, but because he began to feel he no longer truly belonged in that world anymore. Post-game parties no longer appealed to him. The things once seen as symbols of success no longer held much meaning. He did not consider himself better than anyone, but he knew clearly that what he was seeking was different from most of those around him. That created a quiet but increasingly clear gap. There were nights after games, when the cheers had faded and the arena became silent. Mahmoud sat alone in his hotel room thinking about life. He thought about the poor children in Mississippi. He thought about the injustices he saw in society. He thought about the responsibility of a person given a voice and influence. Those questions no longer left him. Success did not make them disappear. On the contrary, it made them bigger. The more famous he became, the more Mahmoud felt he had to live true to what he believed. He did not want to be the type of person who only talked about faith when things were going well. He did not want to see religion as a decorative part of life. For him, faith had to be present in every decision. It had to influence the way he lived, thought, and acted. But that was also when contradictions began to appear. Some of his statements made the media curious. Some of his views made others hard to understand. Many began to realize that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was not like ordinary NBA stars. He did not try to please everyone. He did not care much about building a public image. What he cared about was whether he was living honestly with his conscience. In the mid-1990s, signs of instability became clearer. They did not appear in the form of big arguments. They did not appear in the form of scandals. They appeared in Mahmoud's increasingly deep thoughts about the world around him. He began to question many things he had not thought about before. He began to view familiar symbols from a different perspective. He began to wonder what his responsibility was when faith and the surrounding environment no longer went in the same direction. Those close to him noticed that change. They saw him becoming quieter, more contemplative, more determined in his principles. Not everyone understood that, and not everyone agreed with it. While most of the public still saw an NBA star entering the best years of his career, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf felt he was standing before a major crossroads. A crossroads where he could not yet see all the consequences. On the scoreboard, everything still looked very good. In the eyes of fans, the future still seemed wide open. But deep inside, a conflict was quietly forming. And with just one single decision, his entire life would change in a way no one could have anticipated. And then the day that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf had quietly sensed for many years finally arrived. It did not appear in the form of a serious injury. It was not a scandal. It was not a failure on the court. It came in silence. It came from thoughts he had carried for a very long time. It came from the struggle between what he believed and what the world expected of him. In early 1996, Mahmoud was still one of the most important players for the Denver Nuggets. He was just 26 years old, at the peak of his career. His scoring ability still ranked among the best in the league. The best years of his career seemed to still lie ahead. But inside him, another battle had reached a point that could no longer be delayed. For many months, Mahmoud increasingly felt uncomfortable with the ritual of standing at attention while the national anthem played before each game. For most people, it was a familiar procedure, a moment that happened and quickly passed. But for Mahmoud, it became a matter of conscience. He viewed the world through the lens of faith. He thought a lot about justice, about power, about a person's responsibility before God. And gradually, he reached the conclusion that he could no longer continue participating in that ritual in the way people expected. It was not because he hated America. It was not because he wanted to cause controversy. It was not because he wanted to be the center of attention. In reality, Mahmoud had always been one of the quietest stars in the NBA. He had never sought fame off the court. But he believed that if he acted against his conscience just to avoid trouble, then everything he had learned from faith would become meaningless. At first, very few people knew what was happening. Mahmoud chose to stay in the locker room while the national anthem played. It was a personal decision, a decision he believed only concerned his relationship with his own beliefs. But in the world of American professional sports, such things rarely remained silent. The news was quickly discovered, then it spread, and in a short time the entire NBA began talking about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. What happened next almost exceeded everything he had ever imagined. Sports television programs constantly mentioned his name. Politicians began to voice opinions. Commentators debated for hours on the airwaves. People who had never watched Mahmoud play suddenly felt they knew exactly who he was. The only problem was that most of what they thought was not like the real person he was. Many called him a traitor. Many said he did not love his country. Some even said he did not deserve to play in the NBA. In just a few weeks, the image of one of the league's best shooters was replaced by the image of a controversial figure on evening news. The most heartbreaking thing was that very few tried to listen to him. Very few wanted to understand what was happening inside that man. The public saw an action, but they did not see the years of reflection that led to that action. They saw the protest, but they did not see the inner struggle behind it. Mahmoud suddenly became a symbol of a debate he had never wanted to participate in. The pressure quickly went beyond basketball. The NBA suspended him after he continued to refuse to participate in the national anthem ritual according to league rules. That was the moment that made Mahmoud understand his life would never return to the way it was. What had once been a difference in views had now become an open confrontation between an individual and an enormous system. Phone calls began to appear. Hate-filled letters were sent. There were threats that made his family fear for their safety. His loved ones had to live with a sense of insecurity they had never experienced before. His wife worried. His family worried. His friends worried. But the greatest pressure still fell on Mahmoud. Every time he stepped out the door, he knew someone would look at him with angry eyes. Every time he turned on the TV, he could hear someone criticizing him. Every time he stepped into the arena, he clearly felt the atmosphere had changed. The loneliness he had once experienced as a boy with Tourette now returned in a different way. When he was young, he felt lonely because no one understood his illness. In 1996, he felt lonely because no one wanted to understand why he acted. Many nights, Mahmoud sat alone after games, listening to the noise outside gradually fade into silence. He wondered if it was all worth it. He wondered if his life could have been easier if he had just done what everyone expected. If he had stood up during those few short minutes. If he had stayed silent. If he had chosen the simpler path. But every time he asked himself that, he returned to the same answer. It was no longer about the national anthem. It was no longer about basketball. It had become a matter of conscience. Some people thought Mahmoud was trying to be stubborn. But those who understood him knew that what kept him going was not stubbornness. It was faith. He truly believed he had to live according to what he thought was right, regardless of the consequences. And that was exactly what made his decision so painful. Because Mahmoud clearly understood the price to pay. He was not naive. He knew his career could be damaged. He knew future opportunities could disappear. He knew he was putting everything he had built throughout his life at risk of collapse. But he also knew that if he abandoned his faith just to keep his fame, he would lose the most important thing left inside him. In the end, Mahmoud agreed to a compromise solution with the NBA by standing during the national anthem but praying according to his beliefs. The public crisis temporarily subsided. The games continued. But what had happened did not disappear. A crack had appeared, and that crack would never be fully healed. Because even if the controversy ended on paper, its consequences were only just beginning. The criticism could fade over time. The news could move on to other topics. But for Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, 1996 had changed everything. He was still the same person, still the same player, still the same special talent. But from that point on, the basketball world would never look at him the same way again. And the most heartbreaking thing was that the most difficult years of his life were still ahead. But sometimes the most painful thing in life is not the moment when everything collapses. The most painful thing is when you have to stand still and watch everything you love gradually disappear before your eyes without being able to do anything to stop it. After the 1996 controversy, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was still the same player who had amazed the NBA for many years. He still possessed that speed. He still possessed that scoring ability. He was still one of the most accurate free-throw shooters in the league. His body had not declined. His talent had not disappeared. His passion for basketball had never left him either. But something had changed. Something invisible. Something that did not appear in the stats. Something that could not be measured by points or minutes played. It was the way the basketball world looked at him. And Mahmoud could feel that more clearly than anyone. Before, each passing season opened up new opportunities. Coaches trusted him. Teams wanted to build their future around him. Analysts talked about untapped potential. But after 1996, that atmosphere gradually disappeared. No one openly said that Mahmoud was no longer welcome. No one stood in front of cameras and declared it. Everything happened more subtly, more quietly, and that was why it was more painful. His role began to change. His playing minutes decreased, trust decreased. Opportunities that once appeared naturally now became rarer. Mahmoud entered each season with the feeling that he had to prove himself again from the beginning, despite everything he had accomplished before. What hurt him the most was that no one could point out exactly what had changed. On the court, he still played well. The shots were still accurate. Excellent games still happened. But the doors that had once been wide open now began to close little by little. Sometimes Mahmoud wondered if he was imagining too much. But then time passed, and that feeling became clearer. He began to see less talented players receiving more opportunities. He began to see conversations about the league's future happening without mentioning his name. He began to understand that in the eyes of many, he was no longer just a basketball player. He had become a symbol of controversy, and that changed everything. In 1996, the Denver Nuggets traded him to the Sacramento Kings. It was a normal business decision in the way the NBA operated. But for Mahmoud, it felt like a sign that life was moving into a different chapter. He tried to adapt, tried to keep playing, tried to focus on the only thing he could control. But the stability he once had was gone. The following years became a series of uncertain days. Each team change, each role change. Each time witnessing his playing minutes decrease felt like a reminder that his career was drifting away from the path that had once been drawn. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing was that Mahmoud knew he could still play at a high level. He was not an aging player desperately clinging to the past. He had not lost his ability. He had not lost his passion. He had not lost his competitive desire. That was exactly what made everything harder to accept. If his body had betrayed him, at least he would have had an explanation. If an injury had destroyed his career, at least he would have known why. But here, he only saw his future gradually shrinking, while he still had enough ability to create special things. Those who had once believed in Mahmoud's talent also began to feel disappointed. Not disappointed in him, but disappointed in what was happening. Many former coaches, many former teammates, many who had followed him since his LSU days could not understand why a talent like that had disappeared from the center of American basketball so quickly. They remembered the games where he was almost unstoppable. They remembered the seasons where he made the entire league pay attention. They knew clearly how good he was. And that was why watching him gradually being pushed to the sidelines became even more painful. In the end, Mahmoud had to seek opportunities farther away, far from the bright lights of the NBA, far from the arenas that had once cheered his name. He played overseas, continued playing in various leagues around the world. Professionally, he still proved his talent, but deep in his heart, he knew this was not the path he had once imagined. When he was a boy in Gulfport, he had dreamed of the NBA. When he shot thousands of balls in solitude, he had dreamed of the NBA. When he scored 53 points in his LSU debut, he had dreamed of the NBA. That was the biggest dream of his life. And now he had to stand and watch that dream gradually move away from him day by day. There are pains that come from failure. But there are also pains that come from knowing you could have done so much more. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did not just lose a spot in the lineup. He did not just lose career opportunities. He lost a future that all of America had once believed would belong to him, a future with all-star appearances, peak seasons, possibly the Hall of Fame, possibly a place among the greatest scoring guards of his era. Instead, he had to watch all those possibilities gradually vanish like sand slipping through his fingers. And in those years, perhaps for the first time since he had found basketball, Mahmoud felt a familiar pain return. The feeling of loneliness, the feeling of being misunderstood, the feeling of standing outside, watching the world continue to move forward without him. But he still did not know that the next challenge would be even harsher, because not long after his career began to slip away, another incident would strike, an incident not aimed at his career, but aimed at the very home he had spent his whole life building. And then, while Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was still trying to accept the fact that his NBA career was no longer following the path once promised, life struck his family with another painful blow. This time it was not criticism on television. It was not political debates. It was not decisions from basketball teams. It was fire. A fire that appeared in the night and brought fear that his family would never forget. In 2001, Mahmoud's house in the Gulfport, Mississippi area was set on fire. It was not simply a fire. For his family, it was the moment when the last sense of safety was burned away. The house was not just a place to live, it was where memories were kept. It was where his children grew up. It was where his family sought peace after years full of turmoil. After all the controversies, threats, and wounds they had endured, they believed that at least that roof was a place the outside world could not touch. But they were wrong. When the flames erupted in the darkness, panic appeared in just a few short seconds. Shouts, hurried footsteps, loved ones trying to get each other out amid smoke and fire. No one thought about property. No one thought about belongings. The only thing important at that moment was the lives of those they loved. Later, many said that Mahmoud's family had been very lucky because no one died. That was true. But sometimes an incident does not need to take lives to still leave wounds that last for many years. When standing from afar watching the flames engulf the house, Mahmoud was almost helpless. The man who had once faced a national media storm could now only stand and watch what he had built turn to ashes. Family photos, keepsakes, objects carrying memories of an entire life, all gradually disappeared behind columns of black smoke. For Mahmoud, losing the house was not just losing property. He had grown up in poverty. He understood that money could be earned back. What pained him were the things that could not be replaced. Family memories, traces of time, items his children had been attached to since they were small. Those things had no insurance that could bring them back. There were mornings after the fire when he walked through the rubble and tried to recognize what was left. A blackened picture frame, a twisted toy, a familiar object now just ashes. Each one reminded him that a part of their life had permanently disappeared. But if Mahmoud was in pain, the fear of his loved ones was even greater. For his wife and children, the fire was not just an accident. It was a reminder that the events of the past might never have truly ended. The children who had already witnessed their father become the center of controversy now had to face fear in their own home. There were nights they woke up startled. There were nights when the smallest sound made everyone anxious. The sense of safety that had once existed in the family home now became more fragile than ever. The adults tried to appear strong. But deep inside, everyone carried the same question. Why did this happen? Subsequent investigations determined it was an arson case, but that only made the anxiety greater. Because if someone deliberately set your house on fire, that meant it was no longer an accident. Someone had made a choice. Someone had wanted to cause harm. And the scariest thing was that no one really knew for sure what the motive behind that action was. Over the years, many different speculations appeared. Some believed the incident was related to Mahmoud's past controversies. Some thought it was a hate crime. Others thought it was simply local crime. But regardless of the cause, the feeling of being targeted stayed with his family long after the flames had died out. For Mahmoud, it was a particularly heartbreaking experience, because at that time, he was no longer at the center of the NBA. He no longer appeared daily on national news. He was no longer the controversial figure like in 1996. He was just trying to live his life, trying to take care of his family, trying to keep moving forward after the wounds of his career. But even after stepping away from the spotlight, the incident still found him. There were moments he wondered if he would ever truly escape the shadow of the past, if his family would ever live in peace like other families. However, just like so many times before in his life, Mahmoud refused to let adversity define him. He had survived a painful childhood. He had survived Tourette syndrome. He had survived years of criticism from the entire country. And now, he and his family began to rebuild from the beginning again. Not because it was easy, but because they had no other choice but to keep moving forward. The days after the fire were full of difficulties, but gradually his family found their rhythm again. New walls were built, new rooms appeared, new memories were created. The wounds were still there. The fear had not completely disappeared. But Mahmoud understood that the most precious thing had been preserved. His family was still together. And it was precisely in the years after that incident, when most of America had almost stopped mentioning his name, that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf entered another stage of his life. a stage with less spotlight, less cheering, but also the loneliest stage, the years when almost no one talked about him anymore. And then the years that Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf had feared the most finally arrived. Not the years of controversy, not the years of anger, but the years of silence. A silence so prolonged that it sometimes hurt even more than the criticism. After many consecutive incidents, the name Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf gradually disappeared from the major conversations of American basketball. Sports news no longer mentioned him every evening. Commentary programs no longer debated him. The arenas that had once cheered or booed no longer called his name. The basketball world continued to turn. New stars appeared. New stories captured the public's attention. And the man who had once been one of the most fearsome shooters in the NBA gradually became a distant memory in the eyes of many. Meanwhile, Mahmoud's life took him very far from the center of American basketball. He continued to play overseas. From Turkey to Russia, from European leagues to many other places around the world. Professionally, he still proved what he had always known. His talent had not disappeared. His shots were still accurate. His scoring ability still existed. Many foreign teams welcomed him as a big star. Fans in those places still stood up to cheer every time he stepped on the court. But no matter how well he played, Mahmoud understood that was not the place he had dreamed of when he was a boy in Gulfport. His dream had always been the NBA. That dream had once been within reach. And precisely because he had once touched it, the feeling of loss became even harder to accept. There were nights after games in some distant city, Mahmoud would return to his hotel room and turn on the TV. He would see NBA games happening back home. See young players stepping onto the path he had once walked. See the league continuing to develop without a place for him. Those moments did not always bring bitterness, but they always carried a quiet sadness, because deep in his heart, Mahmoud knew his life could have been different. Not richer, not more famous, but simply different. He knew he still had many years of peak performance ahead when everything changed. He knew there were still so many things he had not had the chance to accomplish in the NBA. And sometimes, that thought appeared like a cold wind on days that seemed peaceful. What was more painful was that his name gradually disappeared from discussions about basketball history. When people talked about the great scoring guards of the 1990s, his name was mentioned less and less. When people told stories about the special talents who had appeared in the NBA, many younger generations did not even know who Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was. For someone who had once been a national phenomenon at LSU, once seen as the future of the league, that forgetting was not easy to accept, not because he needed fame, but because he clearly understood what he had contributed. He clearly understood what he had overcome to be there. And sometimes, watching history continue to move forward without mentioning his story created an indescribable feeling of emptiness. But it was precisely in those years away from the spotlight that Mahmoud also found things that the period of fame had never brought. He had more time for his family, more time for his children, more time for the community and faith. While the outside world cared less and less about him, his loved ones became the center of his life. Family meals, normal conversations, everyday moments that he had often missed before because of the dense schedule. Mahmoud began to realize that there were things more important than fame. There were victories that did not appear on the scoreboard. There were successes that were not broadcast live. And sometimes a person's value did not lie in how many people knew him. Faith also became his greatest refuge during this period, when his career was no longer the same, when the public gradually forgot his name. When questions about the past kept appearing, Mahmoud found peace in the things that did not change. The years of studying religion, praying, and living close to the community helped him see life in a different way. He began to reflect more on what he had lost and what remained. Yes, he had lost part of the career he had once loved. Yes, he had lost opportunities that might never return. But he still had his family. He still had faith. He still had self-respect. And most importantly, he still had the ability to look in the mirror every morning without feel ashamed of the choices he had made. Gradually, Mahmoud's life became calmer. No more media storms. No more debates on national television. No more crowds of reporters surrounding him after every game. There was only a man trying to live a decent life after many years of turmoil. But even though that calm brought healing, there was still a question that had never truly disappeared. A question that America had quietly asked for many years. A question that Mahmoud himself knew he would one day have to answer. Because behind all the controversies, all the losses, and all the years of being forgotten, there was still a truth that many people had never truly understood. And after all those years of silence, after the controversies, the losses, and the opportunities that never returned, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf finally began to talk about what America had tried to understand for nearly 3 decades. Not to justify, not to seek pity, and not to change the past. Because at over 50 years old, he understood that the past could not be changed. What had happened would still have happened. The doors that had closed would still be closed. The years that had been lost would never come back. But what he could do was speak the truth in the most sincere way. The truth about the decision that had changed his entire life. In the eyes of many people, that story had always been told in a simple way. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf refused to stand during the national anthem. He caused controversy. He was opposed, then his career declined. That was the version the public saw. That was the version that appeared in newspaper headlines. That was the version repeated over the years. But for Mahmoud, the story had never been that simple. Because what happened in 1996 did not begin with the national anthem. It began many years before that. It began from the days when he was still a lonely boy in Mississippi. From the years struggling with Tourette syndrome. From the journey of searching for identity. From questions about faith, about justice, and about personal responsibility. The national anthem was only the moment when all those inner struggles collided with the outside world. One of the things that pained Mahmoud the most was that too many people had never truly listened to him. They heard about him. They debated about him. They judged him. But very few would sit down and ask what was really happening in that man's mind. Many believed he hated America. Many believed he wanted to insult the country that had given him the opportunity for success. Some even believed he was deliberately trying to divide. Mahmoud had heard all of that for many years, and every time he heard it, he felt sadder than angry. Because he knew those people were reacting to an image created about him rather than the real person he was. The truth was that Mahmoud had never seen himself as a rebel. He had never woken up in the morning thinking of ways to cause controversy. He had never wanted to become the center of a culture war. What he wanted was simply to live honestly with his beliefs. For many, that sounded simple, but for Mahmoud, it was what had shaped his entire life. When he was young, he had to learn to live with a body he could not control. When he grew up, he had to learn to live with the pressures of fame. And when he found faith, he believed he had to live according to the principles he thought were right, even if that made life more difficult. Many years later, when looking back, Mahmoud did not deny that the 1996 decision had caused him to lose many things. He lost career opportunities. He lost the position he once had in the NBA. He lost the future that many people had once predicted would belong to him. There were times he thought about the seasons he had not had the chance to play, the achievements he had not had the chance to reach, the dreams he had not had the chance to complete. He was human, too. He knew regret, too. He felt the pain when seeing the things he loved gradually disappear. It would not be honest to say that all of that did not hurt him. But there was another thing that Mahmoud also understood very clearly. If time could be turned back to 1996 and he was given the chance to choose again, he would still have to face the same question. Would he be willing to do something against his conscience just to keep his career? And every time he thought about that, the answer was still the same. Not because he wanted to sacrifice, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he did not know how to live differently. He could not look in the mirror every day if he knew he had betrayed what he believed just to gain convenience. For Mahmoud, that would be the greatest loss. Perhaps that was the biggest difference between how the public perceived the story and how he perceived it. The public often looked at what he had lost. They looked at his NBA career, looked at the missed opportunities, looked at what could have happened, while Mahmoud looked at what he had kept. He had kept his faith. He had kept his self-respect. He had kept the ability to look back on his life without feeling ashamed of the choices he had made. That did not erase the pain, but it brought peace. When sharing about the past, Mahmoud did not speak like a winner. He also did not speak like a victim. He spoke like a person who had lived long enough to understand that life always demands a price from important choices. He acknowledged that the years after the controversy were an extremely difficult period. He acknowledged that he had once felt lonely, once felt misunderstood, once felt pain when watching his career slip away. But he also acknowledged that through all of that, he had never regretted trying to live honestly with himself. And perhaps that was exactly what Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf ultimately wanted America to understand. Not that he was right and everyone else was wrong, not that he wanted an apology, but that he had never opposed his country in the way many had once thought. What he opposed was only the feeling of having to abandon his conscience to be accepted. After so many years, after so many losses, he finally found a peace that no title could bring. The peace of a person who knew he had paid a very high price for his choices, but had never betrayed his true self. And perhaps the strangest thing about history is that it often comes very late. There are people who are praised while they are still alive. There are people who are honored right when they succeed. But there are also people who have to wait decades for the world to understand what they had tried to say from the beginning. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf belonged to the second group. For most of his adult life, he lived with the feeling of being misunderstood, not because he did not know how to express his thoughts, but because very few people truly wanted to listen. But as the years passed, what once seemed impossible finally began to happen. History gradually returned to his story. When looking back on his entire life journey, Mahmoud sometimes found it hard to believe he had come this far. From the boy Christopher Wayne Jackson, growing up in poverty in Gulfport, from the child with Tourette syndrome who was mocked for his uncontrolled movements, from the boy who once sat quietly in class and wondered if he would ever live a normal life, to the basketball prodigy of Mississippi, to the phenomenon of LSU, to one of the most dangerous shooters in the NBA. Each stage in his life was like a separate battle. And what was amazing was not that he had won all those battles. What was amazing was that he still continued to stand up after each time life tried to knock him down. Because, if looking back carefully, loss was always present in Mahmoud's story. He lost the carefree childhood that many other children had. He lost the feeling of belonging when he was very young. He lost many years of living with inferiority and loneliness because of his illness. Then he lost peace when he became the center of a national controversy. He lost part of a career that should still have had a long way ahead. He lost his family's home in the horrific fire of 2001. He lost the position that had once belonged to him in the memory of the American public. If life was measured by what had been lost, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was perhaps one of the people who had paid the highest price for his choices. But time has a very special way of changing how people perceive things. Things once seen as unacceptable sometimes come to be understood in a completely different way many years later. When stepping into the new century, America began to change. Debates about civil rights, freedom of expression, and the role of athletes in society became bigger. A new generation appeared, a generation ready to ask questions that few had dared to ask before. And when those debates took place, the name Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf began to be mentioned again. Many young people learned his story for the first time. They did not look at him through the lens of 1996. They did not carry the prejudices of that era. They looked at his entire life. They looked at what he had sacrificed. They looked at the price he had to pay. And they began to wonder if America had judged him fairly or not. Suddenly, The man once seen as a controversial figure became the subject of completely different discussions. No longer the question of why he did it, but the question of why the reaction to him was so harsh. Then a new generation of athletes appeared, people who also had to face difficult choices between career and conscience. People who understood the feeling of being criticized for daring to speak what they believed. People who understood that sometimes the price of honesty was much greater than what the public saw. When those stories appeared, many began to look back at Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf as someone who had been ahead of his time. Not because he was perfect, not because everyone agreed with him, but because he had lived true to his beliefs when that was still very dangerous. But if you ask Mahmoud what had helped him stand firm through all those years, the answer would probably not be basketball, nor fame. It was family and faith, two things that had appeared at the darkest times in his life. When he was a poor boy in Mississippi, he had his mother, the woman who refused to give up no matter how difficult life was. When facing Tourette syndrome, he had his loved ones by his side. When all of America debated him, he had family. When the house was burned down, he still had family. When his name gradually disappeared from NBA conversations, he still had family. And in all those stages, faith was always the place he found strength to keep moving forward. Perhaps that was why Mahmoud had never let losses turn him into a bitter person. He could be sad, he could regret, he could feel pain when thinking about what had happened. But he did not let those things destroy the good that remained in him, because he understood that the value of a life is not determined by what others take from you. It is determined by what you keep after everything else has disappeared. Today, when people mention Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, the statistical numbers are still very impressive. More than 14 points per game in his NBA career, one of the best free throw percentages in league history. A special scoring talent that many believe never reached his true limit. But that is no longer the most important part of the story. Mahmoud's greatest legacy does not lie in the points. It does not lie in the shots. It does not lie in the records. His greatest legacy lies in the courage to live true to what he believed when the price to pay was very high. Because in the end, history does not remember people just because they won. History remembers people who refuse to abandon themselves. And that is perhaps what makes Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story still mentioned after nearly 3 decades. He was once the boy with Tourette mocked by the whole class. He was once the basketball prodigy who amazed America. He was once the NBA star standing in the eye of a controversy storm. He was once the man forgotten for many years. But above all, he was a person who chose to live honestly with his conscience, even when that caused him to lose things that most people would never dare to trade. And perhaps that was the greatest victory in Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's life. Not victory on the basketball court, not victory over famous opponents, but victory over fear, over pressure, and over the temptation to become someone else just to be accepted. After all the suffering, the sacrifices, and the lonely years, history finally began to catch up with him. And for the first time in many years, America seemed to be seeing the real person of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. What makes Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story heartbreaking is not because he failed, but because he had to pay such a high price for living true to his conscience. When looking back on the entire journey, from the boy Christopher Wayne Jackson with Tourette in Gulfport, Mississippi, to the NBA star selected third in the 1990 NBA draft, we see a person who continuously fought against adversities that most others would never have to face. From a young age, he had to endure uncontrollable tics, mockery from friends, prolonged loneliness, and the inferiority complex of a poor child growing up in a single-mother family. What is admirable is that he did not let those difficulties defeat him. He turned basketball into a place of healing, spending thousands of hours practicing alone to become a phenomenon at LSU and then one of the best shooters in the NBA. But the greatest tragedy came when he was at the peak of his career. The decision not to stand during the national anthem in 1996 stemmed from his faith and personal conscience, but it caused him to be criticized by the entire country, isolated from the basketball environment, and gradually lose the future that his talent deserved. Even more painful was that after his career was narrowed, his family had to go through the arson that burned down their house in 2001, taking with it the memories and sense of safety they had tried to build over many years. However, what is most respectable about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf is that he never let bitterness control his life. He still kept his faith, family, and self-respect. For the American people today, his story reminds us that a truly strong society is not only measured by freedom of speech, but also by the ability to listen to different viewpoints. At the same time, Mahmoud's life also shows that the greatest success is not fame or money, but the ability to look back on life and know that one has never betrayed the core values one believes in. If Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video so more people can know about the man who bravely traded his entire career to live true to his conscience and faith. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of the story, and see you again in the next video with another emotional journey about people who have overcome adversity to leave an indelible mark in American history.